Welcome to today's episode of Courage Permission Slip. I am your host, Kia, and today I am so honored that I get to welcome Robin Tompkins to the show. And before we get started, I want to share just a little bit more about her. Robin is the founder and CEO of Olive Hill, a consultancy that provides leadership development for executives, public and private companies, and boards. She is also an attorney, a financial services professional, educator, philanthropist, and community leader. And as if that is not enough, Robin serves as a global advisor for How Women Lead, which is an organization that focuses on propelling women into greater leadership positions. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, thank you for all the things that you're doing. And, two questions come to mind. The first is, someone that we both know and love describes you as fierce and a powerful woman, and as someone who supports her clients in being courageous in the boardroom and in the C-suite and with their stakeholders. And I would love to hear from you, what is your philosophy, right? Like, how do you do what you do?
Oh, wow. You started with a softball there, huh? Well, I don't know whether it's so much how I do what I do. I think I want to step back a moment. I was getting ready to say, I think when you've found your groove or your passion, things come instinctually. You don't really think about them quite as much. You just know that it's a rhythm, it's a feeling, it's something that you just enjoy so much. And for me, working with my clients or just interacting with people and helping them to tap into that quality that really speaks to them. Also, to help them sort of quiet that inner voice that I think we all have, that sort of is an inhibitor. It's a blocker for us to step out and be daring. And sort of leaning into that and trying to have them trust themselves is something that really not only intrigues me about how people work, but gives me so much positive energy when I see someone tap into that. And so it's less about sort of a philosophy, but just really going with my gut as I connect with a client or a group or a team. And we sort of work through that process and to the outcome.
I love so much what you said there, Robin, and in particular, two things. One, about how, that instinctual inner knowing where it's like you're not calculated about it, it just comes to you. But also, I love what you said about really trusting and listening to that inner voice and how you use that to guide your clients. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but are there ever times, even in the space of the things that you do coming naturally, have there ever been moments where you've had to stop and check yourself and check your own inner voice and that thing that may have been hindering you from moving forward?
I think all the time. Don't we, it's so funny, don't we all have different facets to ourselves? You can use the word, persona or facade or whatever it is. We have our internal, how we really are. If we break it down with our girlfriends, with our sisters, with our compatriots, the people that really know us, warts and all, who accept us in a non-judgmental way. And we can be the the term du jour is authentic. And
Mm,
then we have different facets of our personality that we show to the public. There's the one where we show up at work. There's the
mhm,
one that we show up, I don't know, at the school board or wherever it is, or
mhm,
in your church or your community or on a podcast, right? And so we're always measuring how we're being perceived by
mm,
whatever audience we're in front of.
mm,
And how um, how should I or could I
mm,
communicate what I am feeling right
mm,
now in the best way, A,
mhm,
to make my thoughts and information heard and accepted, but B, we always also think, how is it going to be if I speak up now, how that's going to be received by the other party, right? Say, let's take a very,
mhm,
let's move it out of sort of a conventional situation where you're just reacting to someone, but say something happened in the community or society at large. Um, for instance, let's go back 2 years when we were talking about, and the world was talking about the situation with George Floyd.
mhm, mhm,
And as an individual, you had reactions to that, right? They could be very strong reactions, mild reactions, complex reactions
mhm,
on an individual person, human being point. Move it into the workplace. How am I going to be perceived if I bring those reactions into this situation? Do I need to check
mhm,
that?
mhm,
Do I even need to comment on it?
mhm,
Because my reaction will be perceived one way or another. And that's a very extreme example. Same thing happened to when we saw Asian situation, or it
mhm,
doesn't have to even be a racial situation or a
mhm,
sexual situation
mhm,
or anything like that.
mhm, mhm,
We are always questioning, should I speak, how it will be resolved.
mhm,
Because all of those interactions can impact sort of progress, right? How I'm perceived and whether
mhm,
or not those lines of communication are continue to be open after
mhm,
what I've said
mhm,
has been heard, right?
mhm.
We do that all the time.
Well, and so I'm so glad that you brought up the example of, we'll just say the summer of 2020, right? Because I was in a situation where the individuals that I was working with, it wasn't being discussed. And and thinking about the events leading up to that, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and then when George Floyd was killed, and I had such a visceral reaction to the point where, I mean, I literally did not know what to do with myself.
Mhm.
And I had to examine very quickly, am I going to say something to this group of people and really question, why are we not talking about this? Why is this not a topic of conversation? Because I literally feel like I'm about to explode. Like I vacillate between anger and intense sadness and confusion, right? Like just really not being able to believe what I witnessed. And I said something, and I was terrified to say
Mhm.
something. And especially I was the only Black person on the team. And I really, I was scared to say something, but I knew that I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I hadn't said anything. And so that was real, like I really had to check my values and really go inside. And I couldn't be concerned with how I was going to be perceived after that, because it felt core to who I was. But I will say, Robin, based on, really launching off of what you said, I've been in other work situations where I've just swallowed it. I didn't speak up because I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want it to become
Mhm.
a thing. And it ended up becoming a thing anyway, in past work situations. But I have gone the other direction. I have opted to not speak up, and it didn't feel good because there were things that came afterwards that it's like, oh, well, if I had said something.
You know, in listening to that, I was thinking, because you were kind enough to sort of, before we started today, send over a couple of questions just to sort of prime the pump of thinking. And one of them was, how did you give yourself permission, if you will, to be courageous in certain situations? And if I could put a pin in what you've just shared and share an example of what happened to me in a very early incident in my career, and then I'll connect the dots. When I started out, I was a prosecutor here in Multnomah County in Portland, Oregon. And I call it a baby prosecutor, maybe a year and a half into it. In the district court, you're armed with all these cases that you prep, and you go into a courtroom, and if all of them settle out, you're usually done for the day, or sometimes if the caseloads are heavy in another courtroom, they'll send some over. And so you'll get files where you'll have literally 15 minutes to read sort of what it is, and then you just have to hit the ground running, if you will. And in this particular situation, I was in a courtroom, and such was the case. And let me explain, when you're a district attorney, you're dealing with trial work, not appellate work. But opposing counsel, defense counsel, had the upper hand. He knew on anybody who was presenting for the state, because he was doing a motion that he was hoping to take up on appeal. And lo and behold, it was a case that came over from another courtroom. So I didn't have any time to prepare. So to condense this, to get to the point that is topical, the judge, who was Judge Kirkman at the time, said to defense counsel, okay, it's your motion, why don't you start? And indeed, this was a gentleman whose name will go unmentioned here, who no doubt, I'm sure, graduated at the very top of his class in law school review, and launched in, those people who are very enamored by their own vocabulary and their own intellect. Well, he waxed on sort of into this monologue. And when he wrapped, and let me tell you, sort of my eyes glassed over. And when he was done, the judge turned to me and said, counsel, how do you respond? And I was at that moment sort of in crisis, not crisis in my head. And I said, Your Honor, I'd love to respond, but I don't understand what he said. Right? In the courtroom. And the judge took a beat and he said, well, counsel, that makes two of us.
Oh!
And from that moment on, I was in my way, although I was reflecting it on myself, I was calling out pompousness, right? And I was like, and I was also making a judgment to be somewhat transparent and say, in this situation, I could fake it, right? But it's not about me. It really is, about this situation and how I'm going to react. And am I going to show up and say, I don't understand what's going on, but I'm going to be real about communicating this. And I've also had that same situation many, many times play out. I've been in boardrooms where I've had to sit or with executive team leaders, say in a corporation, have someone present, blah, 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 very technical situations. And then at the end, any questions, and there's silence. And then basically I'm looking around thinking all these other VPs and so must understand this. And I must be the only ignorant one here. And I'll raise my hand and say, I just did not get that. And can you just, and then
Mhm.
immediately after I say that, I've seen people lean in and say, yeah, I didn't understand this either, or this, and
Mm.
it's all
Mhm.
about being so fearful that either our perceived ignorance or our
Mhm.
perceived perceptions will be
Mhm.
taken within the situation in a way that's not permissible, that
Mm.
somehow our feelings or our lack of knowledge equates to, ignorance or
Mhm.
being too emotional. That's where I
Mhm.
want to connect the dots to,
Mhm.
or things like that. And in some ways, I think getting back to courage, it's the courage to be transparent and the courage
Mhm.
to be authentic and how you set it up. It's not always about, say, getting back to the sense of George Floyd, and all of that
Mhm.
emotions that is so real, and being in an environment that it wasn't being talked about. It's less about condemning or placing a judgment on the other people, but it's
Mhm.
validating who I
Mhm.
am in this
Mhm.
moment in time
Yeah.
and being vulnerable enough,
Mhm.
yet courageous enough at the same
Mhm.
time to
Yeah.
say, this is what I'm experiencing, and I
Yeah.
feel a need to communicate that.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the way that we share that diffuses a little bit of the tension and allows
Mm.
people themselves who have their own facades up for
Mhm.
whatever reason. Maybe they're
Mhm.
just petrified that what they're going to
Yeah.
say is the wrong thing, or
Yeah.
maybe they just don't feel the same way and they don't want to be drawn into it. But
Mhm.
sometimes it gives them a little bit of a permission to come a little bit closer
Yeah.
to you so that you can engage in a conversation.
Mhm.
You're not going
Mhm.
to necessarily solve all the problems,
Mhm.
but engage in the conversation. Does that make sense?
It does. And I love what you said about, the people that are around you, that when you give yourself permission to say, I don't understand that, can say it another way, or whatever it is, and how by you giving yourself permission in that moment to forego the perception of ignorance, incompetence, whatever, right? Like all the things, foregoing the chance of that perception to get a deeper understanding. And by doing that, it opens the door for other people who may not have been as brave in that moment to say, just as you said, oh yeah, I didn't get that either. Um, but I'm curious because there are moments, Robin, where I decide to go the other way because, like, energetically, I, you know, can't go there,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Hmm.
energetically, I would rather swallow it in that moment versus getting into, a deeper, lengthier, broader, perhaps hurtful conversation. And I'm curious, and you saying, it sounds like you've had that, but what are the decisions that and they're always split second decisions. What are the
Hmm.
decisions that help you decide, okay, I'm going to speak up and raise my hand, or I'm just going to sit this one out? What's the decision you have to allow yourself to make there?
Well, and I'll be honest. So we talk about things as women of color,
Mhm.
uh, and and the original sort of analogy that I brought to bear was sort of a racially tinged situation, but
Mhm.
also it could be sort of uh, for gender issues or other things,
Mhm.
or it could be, let's take it totally out of the workplace. It could be a parent child situation dealing with in sort of a school. So there are
Mhm.
things that are close to you that are so part of who you are that will stir emotions. And I don't know whether I can explain it, that it's almost like a heat develops, right? So you're
Mm.
so passionate, you can almost feel the temperature in your body rise.
Yes.
Usually, usually for me, that's when I'll take a beat and think, can I be objective in
Mhm.
some sense? Not totally. I'm not dispassionate. We're not
Mhm. Mhm.
robots.
Mhm.
Should I take a beat now to let that subside and then communicate?
Mhm.
Because what is the purpose of this communication right now? Am I just
Mm.
venting to let it
Mm.
off my chest?
Mhm.
Or am I trying to have something be understood? And
Mm.
if it's the latter, then for just me personally, I know I may want to step back and think it through. It's not to change it, but really just think it through. It gives me the
Mhm.
opportunity to take
Mhm.
control of the pacing,
Mhm.
to understand my audience, to understand the type of language I'm going to use,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, how it's going to land. Those are the things that I think about
Yeah.
if I think to check myself.
Mhm.
Um, and there are times when I'll feel like, let's say you're in a leadership position and you know others are looking to you to respond, and it
Mhm.
is a very
Mhm.
tinged,
Mhm.
heated
Mhm.
discussion or something that could have other elements of politics or what have you involved. You can always weigh in by communicating that you do have thoughts and you do
Yeah.
have feelings, and you can indicate, generally speaking, what they are, but say,
Mhm.
because this is so important, I want to
Mhm.
take a moment,
Mm.
think about this in a very thoughtful way, and give you my honest assessment and get back to you.
Mhm.
But the key there is, don't let it take forever,
Right.
especially if you're in a leadership role where people are looking to you. They
Yeah.
don't want to think that it's been wordsmithed or
Mm.
PR's gotten
Mm.
to whatever.
Mhm.
You need to continue to have that genuine connection with your team or your stakeholders or whomever it is. But that doesn't mean that you can't take a moment to be reflective.
Yeah.
But just don't, I always advise, don't just be silent.
Right.
People want to know that you have something to say.
I have worked with many leaders, both in a coaching capacity, but also just, working for leaders like this, where I've noticed myself like really craving some kind of response from them. But I'm curious to hear from you, in the leaders that you coach and advise. What is the thing that makes a leader afraid of having a courageous viewpoint? Because speaking of these leaders that I'm talking about, you can tell when the comment is thoughtful versus when they're just saying something just for the sake of saying something, right? And so I would love to hear from you. What is it that keeps the leaders from saying something in that moment? What is it that keeps them silent in a moment where it's important for them to have, or at least share that they have a viewpoint and they want to reflect on it?
Well, I would go to the first one. My instinctual answer was the legal department. Uh, and having sat no, and I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but honestly, when you're dealing from the corporate sector, um, and leaders, you're always you're always thinking that there are typically three pegs to that stool of your immediate direct constituents or stakeholders. They're your employees, they're your customer base, and they're your shareholders. And so you're not always just speaking from me, Robin Tompkins, CEO or department lead or senior VP or this or that, the other. You are speaking on behalf of an entity that is behind you. Even in the nonprofit sector, or and interestingly enough, even for people who their brand is themselves, and there are people working for them, there are reverberations beyond just them. So I think, and typically they are not just brand new into that position. They have spent years, months, weeks, years, decades getting there. They understand all of the components. So they understand sometimes they're competing interests, right? And threading that needle to communicating who you are and how you think and how you feel in a moment is an art form. That is why not everybody can be CEO of major Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. There's a unique skill set to have your shareholders interests at mind, your employees, customers. How are the things that I'm going to say right here and now, how that going to reverberate out in sort of society? And in this particular age, blowback is so quick.
Oh yeah.
Between the internet and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and everything else, that blowback is real, and it can have impacts in lots of ways. So I think people just get, they get paralyzed, sometimes. But I think if you can ground it in really reading the room and reading an audience and knowing that there's a yearning to be heard, and then acknowledging that at least. So you're not gaslighting them. Yes, we know that there's an issue. We know it's a real issue. And I need, not only just want, but I need to speak to you genuinely. Here's my initial reactions. Allow me the time to think about it and share more on this with you in the days to come. I think is really what people want to hear. And also the recognition, this is where real courage is to say, either as an individual speaking or speaking on for organization, we may not get this right.
Oh yeah.
We may not get this right. We'll tell you where we are right now. We are, I make mistakes every day. I'm willing to learn. I want to learn. Let's learn together. I think that not to be a throwaway, because people are really, really savvy and they're smart, and they know when it's performative versus real. They know it in a heartbeat. And you have a limited opening to make a real, genuine impression. And if people feel and understand that you are earnest in your attempts, they'll give you a whole lot of latitude and leeway. But if they realize that you're just positioning yourself, then you've lost that real opportunity to connect.
And what I hear you say, Robin, is to be human, right? Like to be human in this moment. We may not get it right. here's where we stand right now,
Mm.
right? And I remember oh, this woman's name is escaping me, but a leadership expert I was reading about, who was talking about ways that leaders can be courageous. And one of her points was, don't work so hard to be right, just recognizing that it's a journey of trying to get it right. And it's like, and there's a big difference between that. And I think that goes to what you were saying about like trying to have the perfectly crafted phrase that people can read through in an instant, versus being human and saying, we're trying to get this right. We may not get it right. And I think you are right in that people will give you a lot more latitude if you're just honest to say, I'm not really sure how I feel about this right now, but here's my initial reaction. And leave it at
Absolutely.
that, and come back when you're ready and you have had an opportunity to think through it a bit more.
I think you've put it right. And when you were saying that, oh, there's a song. Maybe you can help me with the title. There is a singer called Jessie J, and there's a song about, I'm having a mind block, but I'll come to it. It's about not her life story not being fully perfect. And that's all of us.
Yeah.
And I think the ability, and there shouldn't be such a huge divide between who you are in your career and who you are in your personal life, or what risk you're willing to take. Say, if you're going to pivot and start your own business, or the fear of that's holding you back. We all will have many, many failures along the way. It is the ability, first of all, not to sort of have each and every one be something that you take on as a statement about your self-worth, right? You have to have that ability to divorce the experience of failure and be able to look at it and learn from it, instead of taking it on and saying, I'm not worth, or I don't have the expertise, or I'm not capable of. We all are capable. We all progress in different ways. I work with a lot of women. Probably 75% of my practice of our clients are females versus males. Women tend more, this is a generalization, to deal with that imposter syndrome, right? I have to have all these credentials. I have to everything needs to be ticked off before I can go for this, because that is somehow an external validation. We're always looking for validation. And so the ability to, whether it's in your personal life or your business life, to go through these challenges, stumble, fail, however you want to characterize that, to assess, well, what could I learn from that? How did that make me stronger, wiser, braver, all of these things, and see that externally, and not let that inhibit you, or preclude you from continuing to strive for what it is that you want to achieve. I think that is a huge issue that people grapple with, and not to, and that should also be the same way in your personal life, and how you show up, and you're transparent within your family, how you they say the shadow of a leader, how your children see how you grapple with struggles and setbacks in the home, in your work, in your career, in your larger, you're setting examples. I'm not perfect. We didn't get this right. We'll learn better next time. Here's how we can do it better. It builds in and works that resilience muscle. And it's so easy to say, but it's really difficult to put into practice, isn't it? Isn't
Yeah.
that the struggle?
Yes. Yes. And I mean, and Robin, I think back to our first conversation where, my things that I was saying had that little twinge of, ooh, I don't know. And I mean,
Yeah.
you called me on it in a very eloquent and loving way, but it but I felt a little of that. I still do. And still I think about when that voice comes in my head of, who am I to do this? And then it's like, you know what? I didn't get here. I didn't come this far, fly this high to stop here. Right. So I'm gonna keep going. Making this big ask or doing this thing is not going to kill me. And something that you said, I really appreciate you pairing how people take failure or view failure um as a statement on their personal worth, right?
Hmm.
I hear that from my clients as well. And the only way that something is failure is if you don't do the assessment that you talked about, that checking in with yourself of, how could I do this differently? Where did I get off track? What would I do better the next time? Or what would I not do? Right. And I think
Exactly.
that's, in my view, and this is what I usually say when I'm out speaking and doing workshops and things of that nature, is that is the only way that it's a failure, is if you don't learn from it. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, well, guess what, friend? you're
Exactly.
not you're not pulling your weight here. But that's the only way that it's failure, is if you just give up, right? If you don't try to sharpen the tool a little bit.
Exactly. I
Oh.
think it sort of boils down to, in some ways, not getting in your own way,
Mhm,
right? What
mhm.
would you do if you knew you could not fail?
Yes.
What
Yes.
would you do? What would you
Mhm,
strike out to do
mhm,
if you knew you
mhm.
could not fail?
Yeah.
And if you reframe failure as those things that are put in your way that give you opportunities to learn and grow and really find out new things about yourself, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And I have to catch myself when I hear myself say that, because I know that you can listen to a lot of self-help folks. You really, when you're working with a client, you're breaking it down
Yes.
to much more refined sort of components of
Mhm,
it.
mhm.
It's not this sort of, come on, you can do this,
Right.
let's go out in the backyard and put up the barn, whatever. It isn't. It is a lot harder than that. But
Yes.
when you really sort of break it down, you can usually get to the nugget that's keeping you from, there's something. And then
Yeah.
once you identify okay, well, what's the
Mhm,
worst that can happen there? Well,
mhm,
once you name it and claim it, you can
mhm.
put it to the side and say, well, okay, that's all right. I don't need to deal with that today. I can
Yeah.
keep moving forward. And it's that work,
Yes.
but really getting out of your own way, so
Mhm.
that if there wasn't the possibility of failure, where would you go?
Yeah.
What would you do?
Yeah. Naming the fear is such an empowering thing to do. People, are afraid to face their fears, hence courage permission slip, right? People are afraid to face their fears, but there is so much power in being able to name it, write it, put it down, shine a light on it, because when you do that, it is like, oh, that's what I'm afraid of. Okay,
Hmm.
well, if that happens, then I'll do this, or I'll try that instead, or what have you. So I'm really thankful that you mentioned that, because that is something that in my view, people don't do enough of. But once they do it, it's like, oh, okay, well then this is what I'll do to deal with that.
Exactly.
So speaking of fears, thinking about all the things that that have led you to where you are right now, Robin, and what you're doing? What fears do you notice pop up for you?
You know, it's funny. I don't have a lot of fears personally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I'd be just spitballing if I were to really think about personal fears. I'm more of the type of person who will leap first. And then I go, whoa, what did I get myself into?
Mm,
Um, so, but if I were to maybe take that question and not focus it so much on me personally, but say, as I look out today,
mhm,
I can address it as one of the fears or concerns that I
mhm,
have
mhm,
is where we are as a society, not just here in this country, but globally. The
mhm,
state of our discourse,
mm,
the the um, antagonism, the vitriol that we have at all different kinds of levels.
mhm,
You see it bubbling up, whether it's in social media, on your
mm,
televisions, even when you're behind your car, or just social interactions. I also see it in different Slack channels or listservs that I'm involved in different networks that I'm in. And I'm concerned about the fact that we have so balkanized or tribalized ourselves and identified ourselves with
mm,
certain, this is my group and that group is other and blah, 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 that we have eliminated the areas of gray where we used to have some area of overlapping, where we leaned in and said, I might not agree, but I'm willing to listen.
mm,
Um, because I think general learning and progression comes from sitting around the table with people who are very different than you and I.
sure. Mhm,
So we come at it from a position of being minorities, gender, racially, ethnically, what
mhm,
have you,
mhm,
um, thinking that the dominant culture needs to be more diverse. But I also think that minorities themselves, wherever they find themselves
mhm,
in the world, also need to think about how they can be more inclusive of people who are very different. When we
mm,
stop to lean in to try to listen
mhm,
to people who maybe at our core we feel, I don't understand how that person could ever
mm,
hold those
mhm,
opinions or
mhm,
ever think that way.
mhm,
And that is just abhorrently wrong.
mhm,
I'm not saying that you try to convert them or that they will be converted, but we need to find ways to listen. If we
mhm,
don't find some way to have
mhm,
conversations,
mm,
then um, that's where I have concerns,
mhm,
because the divisiveness is just pulling um, at the fabric of so many different societies. And we've got some huge problems that confront us, whether
mhm,
they're environmental, whether they're on the welfare side as far as health care or basic needs, or
mhm,
we have lots of migration of populations and
mhm,
just huge issues. um, we need to communicate and listen and just have tone down a lot of the vitriol
Mhm,
and try to find a civil society where we can
mhm,
find some common ground. Those are
mhm,
real concerns that I have.
mhm, mhm. How do you, so the fears that you have about the discourse and, the tearing of the fabric in your circles, in your day-to-day dealings, how do you try to move the needle in building up those conversations to, kind of bring down the temperature on those fears and concerns that you have?
That's that's a great question because initially when you posed it, I had one answer popped into my head, but then I had to step back
Mm,
and go back to something we spoke about earlier in our conversation.
mhm,
When things get so personal and so heated, when is it the appropriate time to step back?
mm, mhm,
Um, let's just focus on the area of uh, systemic racism, racial equity, all of
mhm,
those issues. That was I don't know how it couldn't have been uh, a very challenging, and that's an understatement,
yeah,
year, 18 months, 2 years that has transpired since sort of everybody watched those 9 minutes. Um, and it affected all of us in different ways. But for
mhm,
me, it, and now I'm talking personally, I'm not
mhm,
talking in my business sense with clients, but just on a very personal level. It took me a matter of months to sort of unpack
mm,
how that situation impacted some of my own personal relationships. And personal relationships, not only in close friendships and how we manage them, and some things that, I would overlook, and whether or
mm,
not, in some ways, questioning whether or not I facilitated ongoing unconscious bias from my
mm, mm,
friends by not acknowledging or naming or claiming sort of microaggressions or things
mhm,
that happen on a daily basis. Because who wants to be the one that is sort of the person that calls things out every single day, right? Oh,
yeah,
why'd you say that? Why'd you do, and
mhm,
you
mhm,
want to give a certain amount of grace and permission to people who you care about.
mhm,
This doesn't just happen to be friends, but I know many people have to deal with that within their families, right?
mhm,
They have uncle this or aunt this, or
mhm,
will say things, and the
mhm,
rest of the family cringes internally but doesn't address it because they just don't want to take it on.
mhm,
And you're always calibrating again. Am I going to, what is the purpose for me saying something? Am I going to change that person's mind? Am I trying to educate them? Am I doing a disservice to that person
mm,
by not saying something? And do they assume, especially if that person is not from the same background or an ethnicity or race that I am in, and a situation occurred or a statement was made and I didn't say something, that I'm
mm,
okay with that? That
mhm,
by their not saying something, or what they said is an okay thing. There
mm,
was just a lot of unpacking of how
mhm,
do I navigate, deal with
mhm,
relationships, and um I settled on, I think it took quite a while. All right. So much of what you do in all of your different arenas is about trying to be transparent. You need to bring a more real transparency to yourself, both in your personal and work arenas. That's why I get to, you shouldn't really have to
Mhm.
be two different
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
right? But by the same token, the other thing that I have done is pushed myself more into areas where I will find people who are different than I am,
Mm.
right? Because I
Mhm.
really want to understand, if I can, why, why,
Mhm.
right? Less about how in the world can you? It's not me trying to go in and educate or proselytize or judge or what
Mhm.
have you. But if I don't hold my ear open,
Mhm.
I'll never know.
Yeah.
And I found through those connections, whether they're in sort of the personal realm or in business, um, that I'm finding really I can understand in these limited situations
Mhm.
um, what is motivating some of them and their fears,
Mhm.
right? A lot of it
Mhm.
is fear
Mhm.
driven
Mhm.
actions,
Mhm.
right? It's going back to, why do we act the way we act? And, we're all human. We're propelled and motivated usually by fear of something,
Mhm.
right? And if you can start there and understand and break it down, if again, this is not about correcting things, but it
Yep.
is just learning, because
Yep.
we have to, whether we like it or not,
Mhm.
live by side,
Mhm.
interact with people,
Mhm.
raise our children in similar school districts, and share information, and really get down to what is it that is triggering you so much. And just as you try to learn that about them, I was trying to learn, sort of do an introspective. We always should do an inventory. What's
Mhm.
triggering us? Really,
Mhm.
what is getting at it? It's hard work, and so those are the things that I've tried to push myself into, to lean into some of those maybe uncomfortable spaces a little bit more, because I don't see it in my mind. Other people can feel differently. A lot of progress where we're sort of habitating in these two separate spheres or
Mhm.
multiple spheres, and no
Mhm.
communication
Mhm.
happening between. And so when you take that even on a societal level and you're thinking about building leaders, empathetic leaders, you're seeing a whole lot of turnover in the C suites now that's being projected, because companies understand they have to have leaders with emotional intelligence to be
Mhm.
able to understand not just their employee and customer base, but larger societal issues, and what they're being called upon as business leaders to do in ways that they never have had to
Yeah.
deal with before.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that quality individual in your C suite, you're
Mhm.
hampered, right?
Mhm.
So it is sort of trying to build up that muscle, sort
Yeah.
of that, both your listening and sort of that empathetic muscle, understanding sort of these are really unique things that we are being called upon to deal with. How do we deal with it? Can't use the old paradigm. We have to bring in a new paradigm. And so
Right.
we have to train up leaders, whether they're in our boardrooms, corporations, nonprofits, school boards, community centers, in different ways.
I agree with that so much. And even before, the summers of 2020, that is certainly something that I have advised leaders on of you know, because I think the old paradigm in terms of leading a company and being in the C-suite or being, senior level employees is, to have that like, you know, unmovable facade, to not be, to be untouchable. And that doesn't work anymore. That
No.
doesn't work for the way that the world is working, and with what we know about, as you said, about emotional intelligence, and to what we were talking about earlier about like being human, right?
Mhm.
And in being human, that builds trust, and it helps to build those bridges. And in terms of the societal things that are going on, I actually I spoke on a panel during the summer, a couple of panels during the summer 2020, and someone had asked me, why do you think that there is so much vitriol right now? And you said it, that there is such a motivation of fear, from white dominant culture, of fearing losing power, fearing of losing standing, of, kind of losing, you know, territory, if you will, right? And having to do things a different way, having to bring in different thought, different lived experiences that, dominant culture, mainstream culture isn't used to hearing about or having to learn about, right? All of us have had to, and by all of us, I mean all the non-Black community have had, or I'm sorry, non-white community have had to break ourselves against those, paradigms. And that's shifting in a big, major way right now. And, and the old ways of doing things and thinking isn't working. So getting to the root of what's going on within you or within me. I have to ask myself this question, and I'm not always good about asking it, but what's going on within me that is making me so upset about the situation right now, or feeling so triggered, or what have you? And that question that you pose, Robin, or that reflection or that pausing moment is really important, because right now, the common reaction in many circles, and that may be just because social media and media is so prevalent, but it is to just like respond on a dime to the headline,
Yeah,
or to the little soundbite, right, without taking into consideration, okay, what else could be going on here, right? Like
exactly.
what's beneath all of it. And not saying that we want to justify or explain away, but it just to take a moment to get more information on certain things that that are happening, so that you can have a different outcome.
I agree. You put it so well. There's just one point in listening to what you said, um, which I agree with, but want to sort of tease out a little bit further.
Mhm,
I don't necessarily see it confined to sort of minority versus
mhm,
white dominant culture. I think fear plays its way in um, I'm very careful to use the words, and I constantly
mhm,
uh, bring this up with minorities,
mhm.
because there's also a lot of that fear between minorities.
Oh, absolutely.
So this is
Mhm,
not a sort of just a white
mhm,
versus the rest of the world type of
mhm, mhm.
situation. When we think of sometimes immigration
Oh,
issues,
yeah.
or within cities, or again, I think globally, when we think of when we're looking a lot of sort of migrants from the EU, it wasn't always migrants that came from Middle East or African countries, yeah, Eastern European bloc. People
Mhm,
migrate usually
mhm.
because situations in their
Yep,
homeland or wherever it
yep.
is, it has gotten to the point where they can no longer provide for themselves or their families, and they're
Mhm,
looking to find a way to uh, have a better future for themselves and their loved ones.
mhm,
So it's not always an issue that's related to race.
Mm-hmm.
But it is oftentimes an issue when there are huge eruptions, usually economic eruptions, where you saw after 2008, where we had the whole financial sort of implosion, and then again, so that was a bubble, and then again, sort of around COVID and supply chain, but even before that, when you, not just here in the United States, but in most, advanced countries, not most, but few, uh, this widening divide between the wealth gap, right?
Yes.
It is a huge issue. And
Mm-hmm.
when middle class, whether it's middle class America, middle class whatever,
Mm-hmm.
no longer sees an avenue, or the avenue is
Mm-hmm.
increasingly hard, and when you feel like it's a fight for an ever shrinking pie, people become
Yeah.
very insular, and they want to protect
Mm-hmm.
themselves, and they
Mm-hmm.
want to keep
Mm-hmm.
out anything that they classify as other.
Yeah.
And so there's this continual pushback, whether it's pushback at the borders or
Mm-hmm.
within your community. I don't want to hear about your ideas. I want to protect mine.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, and it really isn't, you don't have to have a master's economic degree. It's not rocket science. People become very fearful when they don't feel like they either, if you're talking about lower class, can earn a living wage, or middle class can afford to send their kids to universities and all of the other things that you think about as far as upward progression.
Mm-hmm.
The economics of what happens both inside countries and globally has a huge impact on sort of the discord, on how comfortable we feel about people moving into our communities, or
Mm-hmm.
sort of being uh, philanthropic in many of the things that we do,
Mm-hmm.
and they go hand in hand. So when I say we have huge issues that we have to deal with, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's climate change, whether it's healthcare, whether it's immigration, whether any of these really impact how we talk to one another, and how we relate to one
Yeah.
another, and how we solve these problems. And if we can't figure out how to find avenues and push ourselves outside our protective bubbles, you know, we spiral in a very negative way. And so we have to, like that salmon fish, push ourselves upstream
Yeah.
in ways that aren't comfortable for ourselves, to rise above and lead in whatever small capacity or large capacity we have to
Mm-hmm.
overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
That's where that courage is. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where I find my passion, whether it's on the one on one or in the larger arena, trying daily as I push myself out of my comfort zone
Mm-hmm.
to help those that desire to step up and be a leader
Yeah.
for the next generations after us, so that our legacy is that we left it better than where we came in. And
Yes. I think back to something someone said from a panel that we were on together. And she said, we're not going to solve these issues in our lifetime, but we have to be on the transition team, right? We have to be the ones that help to move the ball forward, so that the people that come after us can pick it up and move it forward even more.
I love that. I
Um,
think I'll
yeah.
steal that. I think that's great.
Steal it. I can't take credit for it, but I use it often. But yeah, we have to be on the transition team.
Very much so.
Robin, so many amazing things that you've shared. I would love to close with your guidance on this topic of, for the person that is listening to or watching this right now, and they have that goal, they have that idea, that vision, that thing that they have been wanting to do, but the fear, that inner voice that we talked about, has been more important than the goal, the dream, the vision, and they're not moving forward. What guidance do you have for them so they can move forward?
You know, uh, that is a very important question. I don't know whether there is a pithy, succinct answer that covers everyone,
Mhm.
because each person's journey is so unique and so different.
Mm.
And so context is everything. But I will bring it back to something that we both agreed to and nodded when I said, um, first of all, identifying what would you do if you could not fail?
Mhm.
Because there are a lot of people out there that know they want to do something different, but they can't quantify it just yet,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think sometimes it's because there are all these hidden sort of, I call them boogeymen, but sort of hiding in the recesses of their mind, telling you can't, you shouldn't,
Yes.
you won't succeed.
Yeah.
And if you could just move them to the side and just articulate, state, oh, I would go for this, or I would try that, or try the other, right? So to frame it up so that you know what it is, right?
Mhm.
Um, Number one. Number two is, I really do think taking the time, if you are the type of introspective person, you can do this on your own, or if you need, to be held accountable, because all of us love to write those things out. We tuck them away and then we don't go back
Mhm.
and do the work,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And if you do need someone to hold you, be accountable, reach out, find some. If you have someone within your own personal network who's good at that, fine. If not, you can seek a coach to help you. But to go back and to name and claim the things, those fears that get in your way, those are so important to
Yes.
really set them out and work on them, unpick
Mhm.
those, because
Mhm.
when you do the work to figure out what that is, you'd be surprised how often you can, I know where this comes from. And
Mhm.
once you know where it comes from, a lot of times
Mhm.
you can move it off the page
Mhm.
and move the page forward.
Mhm.
I do think those two components, but I really do think our conversation coming at the beginning of the year is also timely, because we all want to have these goals, right? I don't know. I'm the queen of let's get the list out, and then, oh, about February. I don't even want to
Yes.
say March. By the end of February, yeah, good luck with that, right? I do think for me, again, understanding I'm the one that has audacious goals, right?
Mhm.
Breaking them down into subcomponents, into things that I
Mhm.
can do in manageable segments of time is a
Yeah.
great way to work my way through something. Because if I look at
Mhm.
the huge goal, it can be incredibly intimidating. But if I can have a partner or someone to keep me on task to do a manageable piece,
Mhm.
because that also gives me validation once that's done. Okay, you know, some of it, again, is not necessarily rocket science, it is consistency,
Yes.
consistency
Mhm.
at doing it,
Mhm. Mm.
and keep moving forward. And then I think the last piece would be, if you don't think you have this ability, work on separating your personal identity from your missteps or failures, right?
Mhm.
So
Really
that you
important.
can objectively look at, why did that happen in that situation? And what can I change so that if that comes up again, the same result doesn't happen?
Mm.
You will be able to make much better progress if you have a way to look at that objectively than to really than if you internalize or personalize that as a failure.
Mhm.
So I think those are some things that I would leave you with, because I really don't think that there's a catch-all. Because if there is, somebody would have brighter than me would have said it.
Right. Right.
And
We
we'd
wouldn't
all
be
look,
having this conversation.
we
We'd all
would.
have it figured out. We'd all have our dreams like check box. But I really appreciate so much your thoughtful breakdown of these steps to consider, because you know, when we do take the dream, right? Like once, and I think because people don't make a habit of thinking and dreaming big, right? I
Mhm.
think about something, you talked about the audacious goals. My mentor, she calls them BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals.
Yeah.
And we don't make a practice of doing that because of all the layers of blankets that are on us, right? Like our upbringing, where we are in our lives, what our economic status is, what our education status is, what our career accomplishments are or are not. Um, and and so many more, right? But we take those things are weighing us down, and then like the little voices of society, it's like, oh, what is it going to look like when I put myself out there? And oh, what if I look stupid? And all these things play into it. And I think, and so that's the first thing that hinders us from actually like getting the dream down, right? So it takes a couple of tries to do it, right? Just push yourself a little more. Like it doesn't hurt anything to write down like some big crazy thing that you're like, there's
Yes.
no freaking way, right? There's no way, right? But I'm gonna write it down anyway. And then what you said about naming and claiming it, right? Like writing down the fears
Yeah.
and then picking those apart. What's underneath that? Okay, well, if that happens, then what? Okay, then what after that? And then what you said about breaking it down. You can't take this big thing and immediately start diving in. Like, break it down. What is the one thing that you can do today that is like step 50 to get you to that big thing, right? Like you have to break it down. What's the metaphor that we always hear? How do you eat a whale? One bite at a
Two at
time,
a
right?
time.
Like one little step. One little step leads you to, or a series of little steps lead you to the big accomplishment, right? So I really, really appreciate your thoughtful breakdown. It's so helpful and so important. And I relate on many levels. I will say, I haven't said this publicly, but now I am. This year, 2022, is the first time in probably 3 years that I haven't been super depressed and despondent on New Year's Day, because I feel like, okay, at the end of the year, I've written all my things down, all the things I want to achieve. And for some ungodly reason, I get up on January 1 and like, okay, everything should be done. Like, man, I have it figured out. And that is my like type A overachiever part that I'm trying to nurture and bring back from the ledge. But this is the first year in 3 years that I was like, okay, like you've got 364 more days to get this figured out, right? And so I so relate to your timely guidance here.
Well, I'm glad. And I was listening to you and I thought to myself, well, if you find that you have a mind block like that, sort of that's triggered by the first of the
Mhm.
year,
Mhm.
Just like, there is different accounting seasons, just shift it and
Yeah.
have your year start with your birthday instead
Mhm.
of the beginning of the year.
Yes.
Or instead of, I should have all these things done. I really do think we don't spend enough time thinking about all of the things that we have accomplished, right?
Yes.
We're
Yes.
constantly
Mhm.
ruminating on, I didn't get to this, I didn't get to this, I didn't get to this. And we don't spend enough time saying, but look at what I have done.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
that also needs to have some time
Mhm.
for acknowledgement.
Mhm.
Mhm.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
because that's the thing that keeps us going.
exactly. Exactly.
Robin, this this could be a 3-hour conversation, but I'm going to cap it. But I am so thankful to you for being on the show and for all your wonderful, magical, insightful, loving guidance that you have shared. Thank you so much for gifting us with your
Oh,
insights today.
you're more than welcome. The pleasure was all mine. It's always lovely to have a conversation with you.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. I feel the same. So, Robin, before we go, if someone wants to get in touch with you, how can they find you?
Well, they can find me on the internet. My website, Olive Hill Consultancy, can be found at www.olive-hill.co, not C-O-M,
Mhm.
or Robin at olive-hill.co.
Wonderful. And I will share all of Robin's contact information in the show notes so that you can reach out to her. Um, Robin, again, thank you. And thank you for listening and watching. We hope that you grab something helpful and inspiring and motivating for you today. So appreciate you for following along. And until the next time on Courage Permission Slip, make sure that you make your goals bigger and more important than your dreams. Bye.